Yes. All right. It's my pleasure to host Clément Sebastiao, who I met at SFI during the competition summer school, where he gave an excellent tutorial on spatial data science and urban science. And now he's going to share some of his own research here. Clément, please.
Thank you, Moritz. Hello, everyone. As Moritz said, I'm Clément Sebastiao, and today I'm going to present to you a talk titled Leveraging Network Science to Promote a More Just, Sustainable, and Active Mobility. So that's quite a long and pompous title. I hope I'm going to live up to it. But before diving into the concept that I'm going to talk about today, just a little bit about me. Oh, maybe I need to remove those things, right? That might be better. Yes. A little bit about me. So I'm funded by the Just Streets project that I'm going to detail about today, but it's basically a EU Horizon Grants project that we're a couple in. I'm a member of the NERS group, where I'm a PhD student at the IT University of Copenhagen. NERS stands for Network, Data, and Society, but people usually remember the acronym. And I'm here in Boston today because I'm visiting the MIT Sensible City Lab, where I'm working on mobility disparities with gender and age. So I look at the life trajectory, the gendered life trajectories of mobility using GPS traces. This is not what I'm going to talk about today, but if you're interested, we can chat a bit later on. So mobility needs to be sustainable. And I'm not the one saying it, the UN does. We're actually entering into the decade of sustainable transport, according to them. Sustainability, the typical definition is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And clearly right now, we're kind of compromising the ability of future generations. I also don't know about meeting the needs of the present, but for sure, mobility needs to change. One way to look at it is through greenhouse gases emissions. That's not the only one, but clearly emissions right now are very high. If we look at the EU, transport is the first emitting sector of all greenhouse gases emissions. And also, unfortunately, it's still increasing. In the EU, it's the only sector in the couple last of decades who's still increasing their emissions on average. So there's quite a clear problem from that single lens. There's a high mitigation potential as well, as noted by the IPCC. If we look at individual actions for mitigation potential, the first 5 of them are related to transport, taking less the car and the plane, basically. There are 2 ways to look at it. The glass half full is that it's great. We can do things to remediate it and change the way we're emitting with transport. The glass half empty is that if it's a potential, is that we're not doing it right now. Why? Well, if we look at the second sector, it's about energy and heat. This is something that can be solved top down. This is something that can be solved from a government on an industrial level. This is about individual behavior, about culture, about values. So this is a much more complex problem that we can potentially use those computational tools like network science to solve. When I talk about mobility, it can be a bit abstract, so let me be quite clear. Most of the harm nowadays is done by cars and automobility in general. Half of the greenhouse gases emissions I was talking about are for the private car, and accounting for road crashes, 1.3 million deaths per year, or air pollutions, a couple of hundreds of thousands per year, there's a lot of very clear impact of automobility on the lives of people, directly like this, but also even indirectly. Car takes a lot of space, it creates inaccessibility, urban sprawl, and a lot of negative externalities that come with it. And while electrifying cars will be very important in the future, it will also not be enough. An electric car is still a car. It still takes the same amount of space. It still can kill people. It still creates these inaccessibility issues. And also the inevitability of geometry. At some point, a car just takes a lot of space, and there's not really a way to solve that. So what we suggest to focus on is especially to retrofit streets. What we want to say is that streets were first made for people, for human. And at some point in the 20s or after World War II in Europe, the cars took over. The cars were the main mode of transport, and they dominated the space in our streets. We suggest to claim back the space and retrofit our streets for new use, alternative mode of transport. We're focusing on active mode of transport. Public transport is also super important, but here we're focusing on active, so cycling and walking. And today I'm going to talk to you about two different approaches that we're kind of trying to tackle this problem. The first one will be about superblocks, the second one about bikeability. The way we're going to approach it is that we'll look at a problem that we can see in urban planning, try to see, okay, how can we think about it in a more fundamental way from a network science perspective, and from there develop frameworks or tools that can then be applied to real use case working with practitioners. Let's start with superblocks. If you don't know what that is, I'm going to ask you another question. Do you know what this city is? Barcelona, yes. Two ways to recognize it if you're not familiar. First, the Sagrada Familia by Gaudi, but the other one is also the neighborhood around it. L'Eixample, designed by this very famous urban planner, Cerda, the Catalan urban planner. We can see that there is this kind of grid with those cut corners and those large diagonals crossing through. This neighborhood is the home of the superblocks. A superblock is the idea to combine street blocks. We take 3 by 3 of those street blocks that we just saw earlier, and we're removing drive-through traffic. We're removing drive-through traffic and we're redesigning the space to focus not on cars, but on humans. For cars, it looks kind of something like this. Your flow that was drivable through anymore is not. So people that are driving in are only either starting or finishing their trip within the superblock or something like service, for instance. So motorized traffic is still allowed, but has not the priority anymore. We're also removing kind of the useless traffic of drive-through traffic, because if people are not stopping by, why should they go in a residential area? Drive-through traffic can represent up to 40% of the traffic that goes through certain streets. So that's a huge amount. Not only cars change the way they need to use the streets, but also people. Streets become pacified, meaning that we can use them as a social space again. An old car intersection kind of look like this now, with a public square, a playground, where people can play, talk. It promotes local urban vitality also. Okay, that's all great. We love superblocks. It's very liked by urban planners in general. That's a great idea. The problem, though, is that not all streets network are grids. Right? L'Eixample is great as a grid. It's very simple to subdivide within superblocks. But if we go to historical city centers in the Medina of Tunis, Rome, Paris, Osaka, how do we subdivide these much more complex topologies? Well, that's why Superblockify has been developed, which is a Python package that has been developed by Carlson Booth and colleagues. And the idea is that it extracts and then partitions any street network. What do we mean by partitioning? If you take a street network with some edges and nodes, the edges become either part of a superblock, meaning that you can cross them only if it's your origin or your destination within that superblock, or part of the sparse network. The sparse network is the network where motorized traffic is still allowed and that you have to cross through to move between superblocks. That way, we keep the connectivity. You can still reach from anywhere to anywhere else within that network, just using potentially slightly different path. Superblockify has been developed to be open. We're extracting the street network from OpenStreetMap. We're also adding population on edges using the global human settlement layer. Everything's processed in Python, and then it creates files that can be instantly read in GIS software like QGIS. The point is that we don't need to rely on very expensive private data in the first place, but it can also enrich the analysis afterwards. That's kind of the point. We're not local experts, right? So we might not have those very granular data, but we can give a first general framework that can then be built upon. Nevertheless, we start with 2 basic partitioners to see some results if we have nothing else than those open datas. We start with a betweenness partitioner. So edge betweenness centrality, ratio of shortest network path on each edges. The idea is that the sparse network is the edges of high betweenness. So we take, let's say, the 20% of all edges that have the highest betweenness. We take the largest connected component of this subnetwork, and then we consider that this is the sparse network. The other way is that since we're extracting data from OpenStreetMap, we can also use the road hierarchy. There is a highway tag in OpenStreetMap that gives us the actual purpose of the street. Is it a primary road that can irrigate to across the region or across the country, or is it a residential road that's mostly made for the local people? In that way, using a sparse network made of high hierarchy edges, we're kind of reusing what's currently there. We're not trying to change completely every street because some streets are already larger and made to handle more motorized traffic. So in that way, we can handle much more, in a much more cheaper way, the redesign of our streets. To see kind of an application of Superblockify, I'm just going to briefly mention Just Streets. This is the project that I'm a part of. It's a very big consortium, a 30 institutions, including universities, companies, NGOs, and municipalities that are working within Europe, mostly. And the objective of this consortium is to try to rethink and redesign the way we're living within our streets. One of the work packages that was in it, the report is available on Cordis, is about using Superblockify with our city partners. One of them is Southwark, a borough of London in the UK. I think this was a good example to show. This is only one, and that's quite general. But what's good with Southwark is that it's small enough that we can visualize it within a single slide, and also dense enough that it makes sense to use Superblockify. Because Superblockify was first thought as quite a downtown, very well inhabited area. It's not for rural areas. If we use the betweenness partitioner, for instance, in Southwark, so this is the street network of Southwark. This is the Thames River a bit up north. And the black thick edge is the sparse network. The colored patches are our superblocks, and every gray edges that is not within a colored patch, it's because since a superblock is considered to be kind of a new urban unit, if it's a single street or half of the city, well, we're not going to consider this as a superblock. This would be way too small or way too big. So we kind of filter out based on the areas of our superblocks. Doing so, we have around half of the rows, the area, the population within our superblocks and our pacified areas. And the average travel distance increase is 2.8%. What I mean by average travel distance increase is that before we're computing the shortest path just as we could on any streets of the network, but now we have to go first from the superblock to the sparse network, then back to the other superblock, which kind of creates a detour anyway. But 2.8% is fairly small, especially when we look at the absolute number. In Southwark, the maximum detour is 1.9 kilometers. Remember, this is for motorized traffic, not for cyclist or pedestrian. So the maximum detour, removing all those streets for drive-through traffic, is only 1.9 kilometers. Using the residential partitioner instead, we have kind of similar order of magnitude in terms of roads, area, population, average travel distance increase, slight increase in the maximum detour. But I think the way to compare them, which is quite the most interesting part of using different partitioner, is looking at them side by side. In doing so, there's a couple of interesting things to note already, just visually. One of them, it's already a known result in the literature, but high betweenness roads are quite a good proxy for a lot of the high hierarchy roads. Even though nothing is known about the actual design of the streets, we can find back the high hierarchy roads using betweenness. This is already quite well known in the literature. It's always nice to see again. But there's some slight differences though. One of them is that if we look at the residential partitioner, we see much more high hierarchy streets at the north of Southwark. Why? Well, it's quite obvious because Southwark is within the metropolitan area of London. This is the Thames River. Right next to it, there's Waterloo Station. The City of London is just on the other side of the river. So basically, very important places are right next to the north. The design is different. Using only the network topology, we lose this kind of information. Typical problem in geospatial data, right? That depending on how you create your edges and your boundaries, you have very different results. An interesting thing also is that then areas that are completely residential, though, can be subdivided using the betweenness partitioner. So I think there's quite some complementarity in the different approaches. In summary, we see that for Southwark, we have for around 2.5% of average travel distance increase, half of the population, more than that, live in pacified areas. And extrapolating from similar interventions using traffic calming schemes, within and around the neighborhood, we would have a reduction of around 30% of all injuries. This is not very rigorous, I'm going to be honest. The good thing about it, though, is I think honestly that this is an understatement. I think that in practice, if we pacify half of the area would have an even larger change in travel behavior and thus in reduction of injuries. Talking with the practitioners here was quite crucial. We talked with some urban planners in different cities that we had to tailor the tool to work with them. In Kozani in Greece, in Kujir in Romania, in Braga in Portugal, and some were quite excited about it, even in Southwark actually. They wanted to try the tool and they were curious about what kind of use case specific problem it could handle. The nuance about it is that we could clearly see that even though we made it fairly simple, in one line of code, you extract the street network, the population data, and you partition the network, but still you're using Python. That's not still completely accessible. Some other people honestly didn't see the point at all of what we were doing. I think that's also one of our issue that we didn't communicate properly what we're trying to do. This is not trying to solve problems for civil engineers. This is not taking into account perfectly traffic flow. And right now, with no additional data, we're not taking into account very crucial thing like land use regulations. But that's also because we want the local experts to take into use this tool. And also, we just want to give a first radical new vision. We're not trying to solve a plumbing problem of counting how many cars we go into each street. Mostly because induced demand and disappearing traffic, we believe, makes this issue much more complicated than it traditionally is used. So this is all about superblocks. Now I'm going to talk a bit about bikeability. If you have some question about superblocks, we can talk about them now or after, as you prefer.
Actually, can I ask a question?
Sure.
About the redirecting the flow of cars, right?
Yes.
If you close these streets, on the one hand, it's small streets, so I could imagine maybe the flow through the streets that you keep doesn't increase that much, but then at some point it will increase. Do you have any intuition around that?
Yeah, that's one of the very big problem in civil engineering, which is that one of the very well-known problem is called induced demand, which is that whenever you increase the capacity of streets, typically after some years, for instance, in highways, in the US, there's a very famous paper that saw an elasticity of around 100%, meaning that doubling the amount of capacity of a highway will double the amount of traffic in those lanes. And we actually observe the opposite effects of reducing the amount of lanes can also reduce the amount of traffic. So it's a very non-trivial problem. I mean, honestly, for sure, there will be an increase in traffic. We didn't try to compute it. We also believe that it's very hard to do and that the tools that are typically used to compute it are, for such a radical change, will be hard to actually really measure well the impact of it. But there will be definitely some impacts that we're not taking into account. Yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, I was curious about, have you looked at the actual traffic data to see maybe some of these areas have already kind of naturally formed superblocks just by traffic patterns?
So we didn't look into it in that specific work. There's been some work that I'm going to talk slightly. It's not exactly about superblock, but it's about low traffic neighborhoods, which is also a kind of traffic calming schemes. And there are some ways to evaluate if some areas have like this kind of superblockify aspect by putting some modal filtering or looking at the permeability and through route. Traffic data, we didn't use it. Honestly, one of the reasons why is that we don't have access to so many traffic data datasets, and they're usually quite expensive, unfortunately. But that would be super cool to use with Superblockify. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
If I may ask one question, Clément.
I'm curious about my understanding from some of the Superblock programs is that they only through traffic, but you can still start and your triplet block.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether that's the paradigm that you think is most effective, and also how that would relate to, for example, there's certain kinds of pedestrianization efforts that I imagine would require zero traffic. Just stuff that probably require once in a while. It's not really.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So drive-through traffic, some studies where they closed off, for instance, in the city center of Ghent, they kind of applied a Superblockify lag aspect. It's called traffic island, so it's not exactly the same thing, but it also removes drive-through traffic. They measured that around 40-50% of the traffic was like this. So that's quite a drastic change. And also there's other questions of accessibility, because you still need motorized traffic for services or for some residents and etc. So there's kind of I think it then needs to be really like thought of at the local aspect. That's also why we've been fairly general in our definition of a superblock. We're using the name superblock because it's catchy, but any kind of traffic calming scheme could technically look like that. Traffic islands, low traffic neighborhoods. There's a lot of other names of kind of similar qualitatively traffic calming systems. Yeah. You had a question as well?
Just a clarifying question. So what do you mean by road hierarchy?
Yes, sorry about not being clear. In OpenStreetMap, there is a tag called highway, and the highway tag in OpenStreetMap is like qualitative measure. I mean, qualitative. Sometimes it's governments that describe those hierarchy, but the idea is that it goes from a motorway or a primary road, and then a secondary road, a tertiary road, and a residential road. And it's kind of saying that those roads, they're classified like this based on their design. Are they handling a lot of traffic? And their purpose. Are they made to handle traffic in the first place, or just serve like small areas? So here, the sparse network high hierarchy means primary, secondary roads, and even tertiary roads, actually.
We also have a question online.
Yeah.
Esteban asks, what about using a traffic simulator?
Yeah. So we thought about using MatSim and other traffic simulators. It's a whole other kind of worms, let's say, to apply traffic simulators. We're talking about some people that are expert in this to try to collaborate on that. We have not done it yet. And one of the reasons is also what I was hinting at a bit, that it's very good for smaller interventions, but this is very radical. We don't really expect realistically that the entire city would be super blockified. But we also expect that if the entire city is, I think it would be hard even for the current traffic simulator to really accurately measure it. And we're kind of in the philosophy of better to be roughly right than precisely wrong, you know? So that's kind of one of the reasons why. But to be honest, it's also another expertise that we don't have right now. I'm gonna continue on bikeability now, which is kind of the main research program we have also within our group. I'm gonna show you today one example and a couple of the future applications of it that we're having. And it's about bicycle network plans. Many cities are announcing very ambitious bicycle network plans, which is great. The problem, though, is that they can take 10, 15, 20 years. And we also know that growing infrastructure is quite complex. I don't want to shame them, but Paris Plan Vélo, that was supposed to end in 2026, they've built around 40% of the lanes they were supposed to build. We can expect they're going to still build them, but you know, if it takes 10 years instead of 5, that's quite a drastic change. The problem is that there's a lot of efforts into looking at the final design of those networks, how to create the perfect final network. And this is super important. There's an issue, which is that if it takes 15 years, well, during 15 years, we're not yet at that final design. We are at intermediate stages, and they're not really looked in. So we kind of want to see what is the impact of the order of construction. Not only looking at the final stage, because this is fixed, but looking at all the intermediate stages of construction. Because meanwhile, the bicycle network will still be used by people. And also, on 15 years, the mayor can change. The people will have an opinion on it that can impact the actual future development of that bicycle network. So having as many results as early as possible is also quite important. What we did is that we went into a very, keep it simple, stupid kind of approach, systematically starting the growth strategies. We wanted to see if we take just as an input the initial network, as an output the final network as well. We choose as a metric on which to optimize. We just look at a couple of canonical metrics in the literature, and we get then as an output an ordered list of the edges to build. What can we see into that? What is the kind of different strategies and how can we compare them? We're going to focus mainly on two metrics. The first one is coverage, just a buffer around the edges. We look at the area. Area, if you have more data, that can be population, number of metro stations that are covered, every kind of actual goal that you might have based on area. And an intermediate stage of the network could look like the red network, trying to expand a bit everywhere to reach as many people as possible. The second one is directness. Directness is how straight can you go? Mathematical term, the average ratio of Euclidean distance and shortest network path between every pairs of nodes. Why directness? Because the straighter your path, the shorter it is, so the faster it is, but also the simpler it is. And actually for routing, especially for cyclists, if I tell you you need to go on Mass Avenue for 2 kilometers, that's easier to follow than going straight on the left and then third on the right and then fourth on the left. So there's also a cognitive cost of making very complex paths. Those two are interesting also because they're both quite well recognized, both in the quantitative literature. In network science, they're all kind of always there, especially directness. But even the qualitative literature knows those metrics. The Crow manual for bicycle network planning talks about being direct and gives specific values that should be met by a bicycle network. Looking at the two intermediate stages, we can see that for the same length, we would have very different shapes at the intermediate stages. We don't believe there's one that is necessarily better than the other, but there's a clear different choice made. There are clearly some advantages and disadvantages to each. So there's kind of a political choice to make here. We want to make it more explicit and quantitative, basically. Connectedness constraint on the network creates a kind of trade-off that we have to look into. If we don't, well, you can have both high coverage and high directness with a very completely exploded network. This is closer to the reality in practice, honestly. This experience of having 20 meters of protected bicycle lanes that ends in the middle of nowhere. But that's not great. Cyclists do not like that. So we're kind of focusing on trying to not increase the number of components throughout the growth. And then it creates a trade-off for the same number of edges. We can have very different looks. We start as simple as possible. A grid, 10 by 10, 180 edges. That's as simple as we can be. And we're going to design three kinds of order. Random orders, keeping the connectedness constraints. Greedy orders that are optimizing greedily a metric. We're choosing a greedy algorithm because, well, it's so simple that we can explain it perfectly, and that's very easy to run. But also because we want to start as simple as possible. We could do simulated annealing. We could do evolutionary algorithm. But then all of a sudden, it's a very complicated machine. Maybe we can have good enough results in the first place with those greedy algorithms. And then we also design manual orders. What we mean by that is that we have the order for coverage and directness that are trying to create what we know would be the ceiling of how good can you have a growth for this specific metric. Because I hope I'm smart enough to find them. I don't know. And then we have a hierarchy manual orders that tries to be, if you as a human, you were tasked into finding an order of growth, not knowing anything else, then the final network will be this grid. How would you grow it? This is one example. So from the blue nodes, then the pink ones, the orange ones, and the yellow ones. And the idea was to follow basic common assumptions and heuristic, being symmetrical, trying to cover a bit everywhere with a coarser grid in the first place, focusing first on the center. Basic assumptions that might not be true, but without additional data seems good enough. To compare the strategies, we're going to compare the area under the curve. The initial and the final stages of all our networks are fixed, right? So what's important is the curve in between. And also in that way, we can simplify an entire growth strategy within a single dot, within a scatter plot of the AUCs, and create a Pareto front comparing the optimal trade-offs. Again, we don't think coverage is inherently better than directness, so we're not trying to create a composite metric that would be a bit arbitrary. We don't want to cook a perfect metric. We want to see the trade-offs. Looking at the results for the regular grid, this is kind of what it looks like. This is the area of coverage, of directness, and I go a bit more in detail in the paper, but there are two things that are quite important to see. First one, the manual orders are obviously the best. Thankfully, I'm smarter than a greedy algorithm on a grid. That's great. But more seriously, I think that what's interesting is that they're not that far from the greedy orders. In terms of IETF coverage, it's basically the same. And we can see that most of the greedy orders are fairly close to the Pareto front, if not on the Pareto front. So it means that even perfect manual orders are close to greedy orders. And this is important. Why? Because the grid is simple. We can do a manual orders, but if I give you a real bicycle network plan, this is not trivial to design a manual order. And we're not talking about 180 edges. We can think about thousands of edges. So having a good approximation using simple algorithm is quite important. The second one is that the random orders are quite far from those greedy orders. Again, that might sound obvious, but in practice, if you look at real bicycle growth, it looks closer to random growth than to a greedy growth. Why? Because there's a lot of local political friction that creates a lot of very complex, non-trivial behavior, making the growth from a pure network science perspective very hard to follow a simple logic. We're also expanding into this paper to other urban patterns to try to compare from a grid to other kinds of typical urban patterns we can encounter, like a grid with a diagonal or a radio concentric. And in the end, we kind of have similar results for all of them. We have a trade-off by the connectedness constraint. The greedy orders are typically outperforming the random orders. And the results are fairly robust. What I mean by that is that there's always this qualitative trade-offs that we can see between all the different strategies, even for different topologies. This is not in the preprints that's available, but there is also empirical networks that we're kind of testing to see if this still holds for real networks. Speaking of real network, one of our future use case, an application of this framework would be on the Paris Plan Vélo. The idea is that how do we know that 43% of the lanes have been built? There's an NGO in Paris called Paris en Selle. Paris en Selle is tracking the progress of the bicycle network growth because the municipality is not doing it. We talked with them, we obtained their data, we reconstructed from kind of messy geospatial data the network and simplified it, and then we had 9 different timestamps showing the growth, the real growth of the bicycle network. And now the idea is, okay, now we can compare it to our synthetic strategies and see how did it compare. Is it also on the Pareto fronts? Is it very bad on all fronts? And since we're in Paris, we can add new data sets like population or other kinds of infrastructures. Very early results. I'm not going to talk so much because it's still very much in progress, but there's an interesting phenomenon that we kind of expected, that the more you try to optimize further away, the larger the trade-off. So basically, it's more interesting to start as soon as possible to optimize, because then your solution space is kind of shrinking as much as you're progressing in growth. And especially, it's much more guided by what's already there. And since it's already kind of scattered edges everywhere, it can be hard to track. Here, talking with this NGO that's already trying to lobby for certain roads to be built first, that's already what they're doing. So they were enthusiastic about hearing about this because it can kind of support their lobbying efforts. They're lobbying based on their local expertise and talking with the cyclists within the city, but this might be a good way to give them a quantitative, more high view through a network perspective. They were also a bit skeptical about the actual use of it, because when they described how the growth order was decided, it was quite chaotic in practice. It's not very centralized. It's not a single person saying, okay, we're going to build here and then here, following a certain plan. There are some PR stunts here and there that are focused on specific iconic streets. But other than that, there can be very small local friction that creates an entirely different order than what they were planning for. Another use case of this framework would be to link low traffic neighborhoods in Newcastle. This is a work led by a colleague of mine called Christopher Larkin. And they first defined a low traffic neighborhood using a plausibility score. So they computed the amount of through routes, the permeability of those neighborhoods, and the amount of modal filtering infrastructure to give how close to the definition of a low traffic neighborhood this neighborhood is. Low traffic neighborhood is a qualitative, it's an adjective for a place, right? So this is a way to show how close it is to this, ideal archetype in a way. Using those low traffic neighborhoods, we can try to design a bicycle network. Low traffic neighborhoods, they're very interesting because since there is already a low amount of traffic and cars are not a priority, we don't necessarily need to redesign the streets in order to make them bikeable. They're already bikeable because there's no cars. That's kind of the whole point. So using them, we can save on some infrastructures by designing the streets around those low traffic neighborhoods. Not only designing the final network, but again, following the entire order of construction. So all of these different tools and projects that I've been talking about, they're all open, documented code that you can find and run. We try to focus on this, but there's kind of a problem, which is that they're a bit scattered around. For instance, just on bikeability, we have more than 4, but those 4 projects, all tackling a different challenge related to bikeability. They all have, a lot of them have even visuals like web platforms, but they're all on different codes that are not well maintained and that are not very accessible. So it's kind of a messy kind of toolkit. A new grant won by Anastasia Vibornova, Manuel Knapper, and Michael Sill has been one to make those tools accessible. The idea is that we're going to centralize those tools instead of, again, creating new tools that will not be used by anyone, but will make, hopefully, a new paper. We're going to try to focus on creating a centralized platform for a toolkit that will be first usable very easily, but a web platform where they will be usable by everyone. I think that kind of shows how can we, in some ways, we can use network science in a fairly simple way. We're not trying to make very fancy work here. We're trying to make something that's simple and accessible enough to promote a sustainable and active mobility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions on the biking part?
I'm curious for the network you use for the bikeability, whether you assume like uniform distribution origin destination pairs, whether you think like if you use a more realistic distribution, whether the manually growing the network would still outperform the algorithm.
So you mean the Paris network or the synthetic networks? So the synthetic networks, since they're synthetic, it's a bit hard to argue for any other distribution would be necessarily better. We didn't explore that so much in the paper. We were kind of thinking that this would make a lot of sense for Paris, for instance, to add traffic data. Again, traffic data is messy, especially for bicycle, because we have the traffic data for cars typically, but cars have a very different behaviors than cyclists, and cyclists are very poorly tracked. Right now, some of the best data sets are like Strava data, which is not very representative of the population. So finding data on where cyclists are biking is tough. So we kind of use the build it and they will come approach of saying that typically we see a surge in cycling traffic whenever you build infrastructures that are not necessarily obvious to see beforehand, because there are people that are not cycling at all yet. So there are people that are invisible in the data set for now. They just don't exist. They're too scared to bike. So it's a bit hard to see right now in cycling traffic data. Yeah. But this would be super cool to do though, yeah. Yeah?
For the synthetic network, do you consider like an intermediate connectedness? So it doesn't have to be fully connected, constraints by disconnected.
So the connectedness constraint is a huge constraint. So we're kind of thinking that in the first place, if all our metrics are just, tricked by the lack of connectedness, then maybe there's a problem with the metrics as well. That's kind of what we try to look into, because it was not trivial to see how we could define an intermediate connectedness. If you have some ideas, I would be really curious. because this would be super cool. We try to look, for instance, instead of looking at the directness of the current network, because this is a bit very artificial. I use it also because it's in the literature, so it's important to know compared to previous work, but it's very artificial because we measure the directness on the current bicycle network, but people are still biking outside of the bicycle network. So we kind of try to measure, can we create a directness that's based on the level of traffic stress? So keeping every edges, but weighting the edges by the level of traffic stress. So whenever you're building the protected bicycle infrastructure, you're reducing the level of traffic stress, increasing the probability of routing through them. So this would be potentially one way to take into account both directness and relaxing the constraint on connectedness, yeah.
If there are no further questions, and I also don't see any questions online, then let's thank Clément again.
Thank you.